We'll be exploring the links between women empowerment and climate action. Um, Women empowerment has been globally recognized as one of the most effective solutions for curbing global warming. And yet, women remain an untapped resource in climate action. As we all know, gender equality is integral to all dimensions of inclusive and sustainable development. And it's also intricately linked to the fight against climate change. As this really great film showed us, women are worse impacted than men due to climate change. So it's only fitting that they be involved in the process of designing solutions to the problems they face.
Goal here is to really be able to understand the linkages between climate change and sustainable development. And this actually has several dimensions. So when it comes to gender equity, let me set the context. We already have a labor market that is gravely unequal when it comes to gender, right? Female labor force participation, as is a well-known fact, has been declining. The last periodic labor force survey of 2018-2019 had female labor force participation pegged at around 18%. We know that that there's a disproportionate burden of unpaid care work that falls onto women. So often their economic contributions are already very, very discounted. And then the third point is that we know that women's work is, as I said, economic contributions are discounted, and this manifests in things like unequal remuneration. Now, we know when there's a shock, and there's plenty of research now substantiating this in the aftermath of the pandemic, when there's a shock, an economic shock like COVID-19, there's plenty of evidence that shows that women bear the brunt of it. When we take what we know about what the status of women already is in the labor market, and we introduce a major shock like climate change, we know that women are going to be some of the worst affected in that context. So case in point here is, women are already disproportionately represented in many of the sectors that stand to be affected by climate change, and this, of course, includes agriculture. As we saw in the video, when there's a scarcity of water, women lose because they're already suffering from time poverty, and now they have to go and walk longer distances to get water.
Working with youth in many ways means nothing unless we give a strong nod to the impact of climate change upon the lives and the futures of the young people that we work with. And why I say that is, if you think about the Sustainable Development Goals as a framing, one of the things that I always say is that SDG 5, which is gender equality, and SDG 11, which is a reduction of inequality, are like cross-cutting themes that are central to achieving all of the other SDGs. So not only will these two SDGs help achieve SDG 13, which is climate action, but we also need to realize that without SDG 13, if we don't consciously pivot and take action, we're not going to be left with much else, like literally at all. So I think that's one thing to consider. The second thing is that while progress is being made on virtually every single sustainable development goal, SDG 13 is the one where we are dangerously low on progress. And there's a correlation that the more gender unequal places are the ones that are also found to be the least climate resilient. Given that women are the primary touch points with natural resources such as water, firewood, and forest products, they have the knowledge and the understanding of what is needed to adapt to changing environmental conditions and to come up with practical solutions. But their wisdom is largely untapped.
Now in recent times, because of COVID-19 on health, so it has not even touched issues like water or waste or sanitation, let alone gender. So the intersection really of climate action and gender equality is a really new topic, even in global context. So over years, women have been disproportionately impacted. So for example, like we just saw in the video, rural women have to walk long distances to get even basic necessities. Society chooses boys over girls, men over women, from health to education to empowerment. So lack of education even restricts ability to get formal jobs. And there are no bank accounts for women, and even if there are, very few actually operate them, especially in the rural areas. And when climate shocks actually occur, say a flood or a drought, which impacts a family's status quo, then they have very few resources to fall back upon. So the question really is, what do women need to cut this vulnerability in the face of climate shocks? So one way is to create livelihood opportunities for women, which will help them tide over this period of uncertainty brought forth by the climate shock. And one of the growing climate action sectors in India is the renewable energy sector. So I think the previous panel was on that. It's estimated to touch about 450 gigawatt by 2030, touching 100 gigawatt already. But what we see is the utility scale RE has grown significantly, whereas off-grid and decentralized projects are lagging. So India added 1.5 gigawatt of utility scale solar capacity in Q2 of 2021, compared to a very small 417 megawatt of rooftop solar projects. So these differences arise mainly because utility scale RE is more favorable to financiers. But it is important to note that these decentralized renewable energy solutions provide more than just clean energy access. The rooftop solar segment actually represents a major opportunity for women employment, specifically for Indian rural women, a largely untapped pool in India. So currently, women account for an estimated 11% of the workforce in the rooftop solar segment in India, which is significantly lower than the global average of 32% in the same sector. So engaging women in clean energy becomes very pertinent, as they are often disproportionately vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And the IUCN actually reports that less than a third of 65 countries surveyed had appointed a gender focal point in the Ministry of Energy. So even when there were focal points who were appointed, they lacked expertise and the understanding to kind of map the gender energy nexus, as well as mechanisms of integration. So raising awareness and building momentum for gender responsive innovations and climate action initiatives is the need of the hour that would promote women's advancement and empowerment.
The job market and labor markets is such a large ecosystem, right? And as you rightly pointed out, we've had high levels of economic growth in India for quite a while, though for several years it's been diminishing. But we've had high levels of economic growth, but this is not translated into enough jobs in the economy. And certainly not good jobs in the economy, right? So we actually have what many would consider a fairly low unemployment rate, but the reality is that much of our population is deeply underemployed. So they're in jobs that are low productivity and low wage work, and that at the tail end of that spectrum are women and young people, right? The most vulnerable groups in our society are at the tail end of that. So one thing to keep in mind, and I really appreciated both my panelists' comments. I think Smitha was talking a little bit about the potential in the solar sector and other renewable energy sectors as they emerge, the potential opportunities for women. And I think while all of that is true, I think it's very critical that we also examine what these value chains look like, and that we're not just looking at creating more livelihoods for women, but that we're also looking at creating good livelihoods for women that are actually equitable to the opportunities that men have, right? So where in this renewable energy value chain are women being placed? Are they just being placed into distribution of the last mile solar lanterns? Or actually, are they also getting the kinds of jobs in the production of solar panels, or in the engineering jobs, or the high value add jobs in that particular value chain? And I think that that's really, really fundamental for us to consider. So opportunities, absolutely, new emerging opportunities in renewable energy sectors, definitely, but what the quality of that job is and where on that value chain it falls is equally important.
Therefore, the need is to place more emphasis and trust on the social dimension of energy and couple it with economic growth by leveraging the wide talent pool of women and creating an enabling policy environment. So what is it that actually can be done? First point I would like to say is probably the training and the skill development part of it. So India has a requirement about 100 million plus skilled workers by 2022. Yet over a large portion of women, actually, working age women, receiving any form of vocational training over the past decade. It has been a minuscule increase of about 0.1% in 2019 from about a decade back, whereas the increase for men in the same period was much higher. So while India has actually made a head start on skill development with short-term skill development schemes brought in by the Prime Minister, the women participation in these schemes has largely been conventionally feminized sectors, like beauty, apparel, entertainment, these kind of sectors. So this is demonstrative evidence of the shortcomings of non-inclusion of gender focus at a policy level. The need is therefore to take a gender-neutral approach for an equitable and just energy transition, so to say. So initiatives such as Solar Mamas, which is an Indian-based NGO in Rajasthan, wherein women from rural areas undergo a 6-month training program on solar engineering, which kind of empowers them in the long run. So this is an example of how the right training, uneducated and semi-literate can operate and manage high technology.
Also, I think one thing that we need to acknowledge is the U-shaped curve that exists in employment within India. So you see that women at either end of the economic spectrum, so the very rich and the very poor, female labor force participation is higher, and in the middle, it slumps. So if you put it on an XY axis, it looks like a U. That similar U-shaped curve also exists in relation to educational attainment. So you combine these two U-shaped curves with the diminishing female labor force participation rate, and it speaks to one singular thing, which is structural barriers that are limiting women or inhibiting women from joining the labor force. Why are women and girls all seen in certain feminized careers, right? Naturalized women's work, right? It's because they've been told that you shouldn't be working because that's not a place for women and girls. And if you do work, here are the 4 professions that you can be engaged in, right? And unlearning that begins very, very early.
So in terms of converging climate action and women empowerment, access to clean energy has led to significant improvement in women's status. That in turn has an impact on other development outcomes. So efforts to expand clean energy with a development lens also needs to also adopt a gender lens. So financing low carbon decentralized energy solutions, like I mentioned before, including standalone systems, mini grids, will offer great opportunities for engaging women in design, delivery, and operations. So across all the 3 spectrums, so to say. However, while utility scale RE has gotten better traction with financiers in countries like India, smaller, lower carbon projects often get left out. So at a local level, if you see, challenges in financing decentralized energy solutions are mainly because of the perceived risk of lending to poorer communities and the mismatch in the return expectations. So the lack or limited understanding among financiers and investors about local communities, appropriately structuring the financing mechanisms, the risk mitigation mechanisms, all these play a big role in not meeting the requisite demand.
We can't place the burden of change upon women and girls alone. We have to look at their ecosystem. So step 1 is help them build a toolbox to let their voice and their wisdom shine. And that's through investing in girls' agency. And number 2 is invest in social programs that look at stakeholders and duty bearers and ecosystem.
And lastly, I think capacity building initiatives. So capacity building programs aimed at helping women to adapt and build resilience to climate impacts are also essential to enable their inclusion. For example, programs that promote gender responsive approaches to natural resource management that have it would help women to understand administrative practices for land acquisition for farming, facilitate easy access to credit, etc.